Dr. Crawford Tillinghast, assistant to the revered physicist, Dr. Edwards Pretorius, adjusts a few programs on his professor's new invention, a machine called the resonator, which is supposed to activate and enlarge the pineal gland in hopes of using it as a sixth sensory organ. He then turns the machine on and is surprised to see colorful lights accompanied by a gust of wind and vibrations, which allow him to see mysterious creatures swirling about in the air. Curious, Dr. Crawford goes closer to the creature to inspect it, but is bitten by it. The doctor forcefully removes the creatures from his body and runs to Dr. Edwards to report what happened. Dr. Edwards excitedly turns on the machine, is fascinated to see the creatures, and ignores his assistant's warning to turn off the machine as it starts to operate on its own, which leads the situation to go out of hand. Dr. Edwards waits to see more from the mysterious world, even though things start turning ominous, and all the windows and the screens in the room start breaking. Scared out of his mind, Dr. Crawford runs out of the room and makes his way out of the compound of the Pretorius estate, but is caught and arrested by the police, who have been called by a disturbed neighbor. The police check out the property to find Dr. Edwards decapitated, but find no murder weapon or blood at the scene. Dr. Crawford is charged with his professor's murder, as his were the only fingerprints found at the scene, but he is admitted to an insane asylum as a result of his fantasy-like account of what happened to Dr. Edwards. The next day, Jordan Fields from the DA's office takes the renowned psychiatrist, Dr. Katherine McMichaels, to see Dr. Crawford and evaluate his sanity to stand trial. After talking to Dr. Crawford, Dr. Katherine orders a CT scan, despite opposition from the director of the asylum, Dr. Block. To everyone's utter surprise, an enlarged pineal gland is seen on the CT scan, which gives Dr. Crawford's story more credibility. Dr. Katherine becomes convinced of Dr. Crawford's innocence and fights to have him released into her custody, hoping to recreate the scene from the night in question, study it up close, and figure out what happened to Dr. Edwards. That evening, the cheerful detective Bubba Brownlee joins the doctors and escorts them to the Pretorius estate. The trio enters the estate, and as they proceed inside, they realize that the power has been turned off and it's completely dark. As Detective Bubba and Dr. Katherine make their way to the basement to turn the power back on, Dr. Crawford discreetly makes his way to the attic, where the resonator is kept. Alarmed by the patient's disappearance, Dr. Katherine and the detective make their way around the house trying to locate him before he endangers himself. They get to the attic and find Dr. Crawford, quite upset, once again living through the night of the accident and declaring that this is the place where his mentor was eaten by a creature. After the traumatized Dr. Crawford calms down, the group decides to recreate the experiment and see for themselves what the resonator is capable of. Detective Bubba makes dinner for everyone, and Dr. Katherine reads the research papers to get acquainted with the concept, while Dr. Crawford tries to fix up the resonator for the experiment. Once the machine is ready, Dr. Crawford warns everyone not to make any movements once the vibration phase commences and starts the machine. After a gust of wind accompanies a colorful light, the vibration starts, which after a few moments reveals some swirling creatures. Despite the warning not to move, Detective Bubba goes closer to get a better look at the creatures and is bitten by one of them. He fights and frees himself from the creature, and just as Dr. Crawford runs to turn off the machine, he hears his name being called from a different dimension. Moments later, Dr. Edwards comes out of the dark and reveals himself covered in slime. He then explains that only his body is dead, as a way of providing his mind a means to traverse into another dimension, to the world beyond. Even more shocking, Dr. Edwards' face starts changing to that of a different creature and attempts to attack the trio, brushing away the bullets fired from the detective's gun. Amidst the chaos, Dr. Crawford runs to the resonator and shuts it off, which eliminates Dr. Edwards and the creatures before they can attack the group. Now that Dr. Crawford's claims of a different supernatural world have been confirmed, the group takes time to process what they have witnessed. Dr. Katherine is exhilarated by the experience, while the men are terrified and opt to stop the experiment and resign for the night. The next morning, over breakfast, Dr. Katherine asks the men to help her repeat and complete the experiment. She argues that the pineal gland enlargement could explain the pathology behind schizophrenia, and that they might get a breakthrough in treating the debilitating disease. The detective and Dr. Crawford want to hear none of it, and adamantly suggest they should leave as soon as possible, fearing they will only endanger themselves. Dr. Katherine is not convinced, and she pleads with her companions to take some rest and consider her proposal for the greater good. Hence, everyone goes off to different bedrooms to take some rest. After a restless few hours, Dr. Katherine, still in her pajamas, discreetly goes to the attic to give the machine a try. She quietly turns the resonator on, which results in vibrations all over the house. Dr. Crawford is awakened by a resulting headache, and knowing it came from the machine, runs to the attic to check it out. There, he finds Dr. Katherine manipulating the machine and begs her to turn it off immediately. However, the psychiatrist is drunk with curiosity and refuses to oblige, and when Dr. Crawford proceeds to turn it off himself, she distracts him by kissing him. At this moment, both the doctors are terrified to hear Dr. Edwards' voice as he appears in his disfigured creature form, making sleazy comments and taunting his assistant to join him on the other side, where discoveries are endless. Seeing the creature form of Dr. Edwards, Dr. Katherine becomes frightened and opts to distract the monster while Dr. Crawford turns off the machine. However, the plan doesn't go as hoped, and the monster, Dr. Edwards, snatches the psychiatrist. Shocked, Dr. Crawford runs out of the room and heads to the basement to shut off the main power line. Detective Bubba chases Dr. Crawford thinking he is trying to escape and follows him to the basement. As they get to the basement, both men are utterly terrified to see it filled with slimy water, which a giant worm-like creature is swimming in. The worm advances towards them, with an open mouth and slime dripping everywhere. Dr. Crawford tries to fight, and when he fails, he tries to swim past the creature to the power box, while Detective Bubba runs back to the kitchen and brings a knife to attack the giant worm, to no avail. Meanwhile, in the attic, monster Dr. Edwards holds on to Dr. Katherine, and to her terror, begins to assault her, and then moves on to engulf her head into his monstrous mouth. Back in the basement, the worm overpowers the men, pins down Dr. Crawford, and starts to swallow him whole. Detective Bubba somehow manages to pass behind the distracted worm and turns off the power line, which destroys all the creatures and fortunately returns everything to the way it was. Dr. Katherine gathers herself up, turns off the machine for extra measure, and goes to join the men, and is shocked to see the injuries Dr. Crawford sustained. Dr. Katherine apologizes for going behind the men and causing all the trouble, but to the dismay of the detective, still proposes to go through with the experiment, but this time alone, so as not to endanger the rest of them. Detective Bubba orders the psychiatrist to patch up the almost passed out Dr. Crawford so that he can escort everyone away from the madness as soon as possible. All of a sudden, Dr. Crawford feels a vibration and wakes up, screaming and warning that Dr. Edwards is plotting to restart the machines from the other world. Detective Bubba rushes to the attic to check what's going on. There, he sees all the components of the machine have been restarted, and when he tries to manually turn them off, he is repulsed by an electric current, which also robs him of his gun. As he tries to figure out what to do next, Dr. Katherine and Dr. Crawford join him, hoping to help. The machine then starts spraying a slimy substance and covers the doctors, who try to duck down to protect themselves. When Detective Bubba tries to help them, he gets in the firing line and becomes completely covered. Unfortunately, the slime starts to engulf the detective and brutally murders him. The doctors are shocked by this, but don't have the time to process it as Dr. Edwards, in monster form, appears out of nowhere and takes hold of Dr. Katherine with one of his tentacle limbs. Before Dr. Crawford can react and try to help the psychiatrist, he starts experiencing pain as his enlarged pineal gland pushes out through a hole in his forehead, which causes him to completely detach from reality and see his surroundings differently. Dr. Katherine struggles to free herself from the tentacles and uses a fire extinguisher to spray and freeze the resonator machine, which destroys the monster momentarily. She then checks on Dr. Crawford, but finds him unresponsive. A few hours later, the surviving doctors are rescued by the police and taken to the insane asylum to be examined due to the wildness of Dr. Katherine's testimony of the events. Dr. Block examines the unresponsive body of Dr. Crawford and is freaked out when the enlarged pineal gland starts moving about outside the body. She then reports to the DA that Dr. Katherine is unethical and is also suffering from a psychotic episode. The confused DA leaves Dr. Katherine in Dr. Block's custody, who orders electroshock therapy to neutralize the fellow psychiatrist. While Dr. Katherine gets strapped in the bed to receive the painful therapy, Dr. Crawford wakes up, wanders out of his examination room, and discreetly walks around the hospital. Moments later, Dr. Block comes to check on him and is frustrated to find him missing. She searches for him, and after following a trail of blood, finds him in the pathology unit, feasting on preserved organs. She tries to calm down Dr. Crawford and gets him to stop eating. As she calmly explains that she will help figure out what is wrong with him, he attacks and murders her before escaping. After some time, the hospital staff discovers the director's body, and chaos ensues. Dr. Catherine's shock therapy is halted right before it starts, and she manages to escape from the hospital and get away with a stolen car. She changes her clothes, equips herself with a bomb, and goes to the Pretorius estate to blow up the machine and the home, hoping to prevent Dr. Edwards and the creatures from ever coming back. After successfully placing the bomb, Katherine runs into Dr. Crawford, who managed to escape from the hospital after attacking some paramedics and stealing their ambulance. Dr. Crawford ties Dr. Katherine and professes his love to her, asking her to be with him. This interaction is interrupted by Dr. Edwards, who has appeared from the other dimension and is planning to attack the doctors. Dr. Crawford distracts Dr. Edwards and takes it to another room to give Dr. Katherine a chance to escape. Dr. Katherine manages to free herself, and as she proceeds to run out of the house, she is terrified to stumble upon Dr. Crawford's dismantled body. She runs back up to the attic and is faced off with Dr. Edwards, who advances towards her, hoping to murder her and transport her to his side of the world once and for all. Dr. Crawford's reassembled body tells Dr. Katherine to run while sacrificing himself to stay back and fight off the crazed Dr. Edwards. Dr. Katherine watches in horror as Dr. Crawford is totally obliterated and swallowed up by the monster. With seconds remaining on the bomb timer, Dr. Katherine jumps out of the attic's window and lands on the lawn with a gruesome knee injury. The movie ends as the attic explodes and Dr. Katherine responds to the curious neighbors with a burst of mad laughter with tears flowing down her face. And with that, the movie ends. I hope you enjoyed our video. Watch the next recaps on the screen and don't forget to subscribe for amazing videos. See you in the next one.